So, moving to this is sort of a second part of today's lecture, which is population growth. Okay, so what we know is population is still growing, but it's growing more slowly, and it's predicted to stabilize sometime in the second half of the 20th century. This is all great news. So, is population growth even an environmental problem? Well, there are some reasons I think you would have to say maybe not. Uh, to the extent the population is still growing, maybe it's not really even the main thing that we should be focusing on. To give you a sense of that, 17% of the world's wealthiest people, that is, people in the United States, Western Europe, Japan, Singapore, wealthy countries in the world, consume about 80%, and this is, a small portion of the world's population, 17%, consume 80% of the world's resources, which leaves the other 6.7% of the world's, 6.7 billion people on the planet living on the remaining 20%. That's huge inequality. And what you see that in this graphic, you see that in red here, for example, the United States, with about 4% of the world's population, shows up on this graphic really, really big. It's graphing consumption, ecological consumption from the world's natural resources, and creation of pollution and so on. And you compare that to Africa in this example, and you see the entire continent geographically in terms of square miles. The United States would fit into the continent of Africa many times over. But on this graphic of consumption, what you see is the United States is many times bigger than the entire continent of Africa, which represents the fact that the US has extraordinarily high consumption rates. And what you see in this graphic also is that that's characteristic of Western Europe and some parts of Asia as well. And this is a quote that I'm struck by an economist named Fred Pierce, an environmental economist, and we'll talk about environmental economics next time, made the observation that the carbon emissions of one American today are equivalent to those of around 4 Chinese, 20 Indians, 40 Nigerians, or 250 Ethiopians. And Fred Pierce goes on and says, "How dare rich world greens blame the poor for the planet's perils?" And he's right. When you look at this graphic, you go, okay, where are the poorest places in the world? Well, they're in sub-Saharan Africa, they're in South Asia, parts of Southeast Asia. And what you see is that those parts of the world really have relatively very little impact. And keep in mind, where's the world's fastest rates of population growth? Africa and parts of Asia, right? But they're having very little overall impact on the world's overall consumption, and also greenhouse gas emissions, for example. Again, if the United States was mapped by population size, this is what you would see. But if you map the U.S. by map the world by greenhouse gas emissions, the United States expands like this, and Africa shrinks down to almost a non-entity on the map. And that's because the world's richest countries and the world's richest people within the world's richest countries cause vastly more CO2 emissions than everybody else. The world's richest people in this headline cause twice as much CO2 emissions as all of the world's poorest people. All of the 50% of the world's poorest people. So say that again. The world's 1%, richest 1%, cause twice as much CO2 emission as all of the poorest 50% in the world. So that's, today's population is about 8 billion people. So, and that I would have to do the math, whatever that number is. But 1% of 8 billion is a pretty small number compared to 4 billion people, and that 1% is producing twice as much CO2. That's just, that's a huge inequality. And again, those richest 1%, they live in countries where population is either stable or actually declining. So can you say that population growth is causing, in this case, climate change? It would be a tough case to make, for sure. Take a look at this graphic. In this case, it graphs carbon emissions per capita, that is per person. And you look at the US here, very high levels of per capita, per person CO2 emissions compared, for example, to sub-Saharan Africa. Here's a similar graphic about the total accumulated CO2 emissions and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Number one is the US, followed by China, Russia, Germany, UK, Japan, India, France, Canada, and Africa wouldn't even be on this map. Much of South Asia wouldn't be on this map at all, because their contributions overall to greenhouse gas emissions are so small that you wouldn't even be able to show them on the graphic. Okay, so where does that leave us in terms of thinking about the role of population in the world's environmental problems? Should we just ignore population? I would say no. But is it what you should emphasize? I would say no, because of what we just talked about, which is that the world's largest populations are not where most of the impact is happening. Now, impact is shown in this graphic here. This is a very famous identity, the I equals PAT identity. And what it says is that the world's environmental impact is some sort of relationship between population growth, affluence, which you can also call consumption, and technology. So is population the P part of this identity? Is that unimportant? No. But it has also to do at least as much with questions like how much stuff are people consuming, and which people are consuming stuff in which parts of the world, and also what sorts of technology are they using. Are they using green energy, or are they using fossil fuels? That makes obviously a really big difference. Well, let's think about this I equals PAT equation a little bit more, and I'll go through the P population and the T part briefly, and then I'll focus on the A part in the middle there. Population growth, again, like I said at the beginning of this lecture, there are people who say it's the number one environmental problem. People have been saying that for a long time. It's just sort of, the most simple imaginable arithmetic. More people consuming more stuff leads to increased environmental impacts and planetary destruction, etc. And that's assuming a couple of things. One, that population just keeps going up, and that the places where population keeps going up are the places where stuff is being consumed and the most pollution is being produced, and so on. Neither of those turn out to be actually true for the most part. But that was the thinking. Thomas Malthus, economist in England in the late 18th century, made this argument that's basically that population growth is the root cause of environmental problems, and that kind of thinking has been very sort of stuck in place for now a couple hundred years or so. There are other folks who actually make sort of an opposite argument and argue that technology, the T part of the I equals PAT identity, actually stimulates scarcity, which drives up prices of commodities. And for example, fuel prices have gone up a lot, and that stimulates investment in greener technologies, which actually brings down the ecological impact of population or affluence. And there's something to be said for that, for sure. We've seen gas prices go up a lot, and it's not just coincidental that at the same time we've seen, the advancement of renewable energy. Renewable energy is by far the largest and fastest growing sector of the economy in the world today. The European Union just recently saw a transition in which now more energy in the European Union is produced by renewables than by fossil fuels, which is really great news. And that leads to less environmental impact. But there are other folks out there who say, well, is it always that sort of a happy story? Not necessarily. This guy named Barry Commoner, an ecologist, again from the 1970s or so, who argued that, well, it depends on what kinds of technological change you have. And Commoner said, we've compiled a record of serious failures in recent technological encounters with the environment. In each case, the new technology is brought into use before the ultimate hazards were known, and we've been quick to reap the benefits and slow to comprehend the costs. And Commoner was probably thinking here about things like pesticide poisoning and other toxic chemicals. And I think it's also true that as people have become wealthier and as populations have increased, people have used some bad technologies, environmentally harmful, and harmful technologies that harm human health as well. So, is technology either good or bad? The answer is yes, it's both. It depends on what particular technology you're talking about. So go back for a minute to this. So is technology in this case a good or a bad thing? The answer is it depends, and it's kind of hard to know. Are we going to have more advancement in renewable energy, or are we going to have more use of toxic pesticides and so on? The answer can clearly be both. So is technology in the I equals Pat equation or identity good or bad? The answer is both. What I want to emphasize now is I want to talk about the A part of the I equals Pat identity, affluence, and emphasize that numbers. Affluence, again, is basically another way of saying consumption. Consumption is not just a matter of numbers, it's a matter of lifestyles. Here's Mahatma Gandhi, the independence leader of India, who fought the British successfully and did so partly by refusing to consume consumer products produced in Great Britain, much to the dismay and chagrin of British colonial rulers. And Gandhi was successful and actually made a kind of low consumption lifestyle into a political tool for empowerment and liberation of what became independent India. And Mahatma Gandhi very famously, his entire worldly possessions consisted of a few pieces of cloth to cover himself, a pair of eyeglasses, a walking stick, and a copy of the Bhagavad Gita, and that was about it, right? And they compare that, say, to this is Russian oligarch, billionaire Roman Abramovich, if you've ever heard of him. He used to be, those of you who follow soccer might know that he used to own the Chelsea football club in Great Britain, and owns two of the world's largest yachts, including this one, which is actually, I've seen more recent numbers that show that it's worth more than $1 billion. It's got things like an underwater submarine docking port so that he can get on and off a ship without the peasants ever actually seeing him. And these, I mean, I think you're getting the point here, right? You compare that lifestyle to this lifestyle. Which one has a larger ecological footprint? Well, I'm picking on Russian oligarchs here because, frankly, they deserve to be picked on. But it's not just Russians, it's the world as well. I mean, the United States, there are plenty of billionaires and so on I could have picked, but again, the Russians kind of deserve it. But right now, But think about the U.S. as well. Think about our houses. We have some of the biggest houses in the world on this graphic here. The U.S. only behind Australia in terms of the sort of square footage of houses. Houses keep getting bigger, even while the per household family size has gone smaller and smaller. So, family size is just a little over two people in the household, and yet the houses have been getting bigger and bigger. And so it's smaller numbers of people living in bigger and bigger houses, and you can see the ecological consequences of that. More materials, more energy, and so on going into housing a smaller number of people. You compare that, for example, to Bangladesh, where the average household size is typically somewhere between 5 and 10 people, and the US, where it's about 2.5 people, and yet Americans live in much bigger houses. And you ask the question, who exactly is having the greater ecological impact here in the I equals Pat equation? Well, it has a lot to do with not just the question of affluence, but how that affluence is distributed. And also the population question comes back to a question of, okay, is population growing more in Bangladesh? Well, we just learned actually population is basically stable in Bangladesh. And it's stable in the U.S. too. But the U.S., in this case, is consuming a lot more stuff per person. So the population part of the story kind of just drops out altogether in that story, which is what I'm saying here. And then one footnote I want to make, and obviously this is a big complex topic. There's a lot to be said here that I'm leaving unsaid because it is a big complex topic. So I'm oversimplifying. There are lots of cases where I think you can make a very persuasive argument that localized population growth has had significant impacts. This is the case in Brazil, where for political reasons, for generations now, decades, we've seen Brazilian leaders sending poor people from urban slums out into the Brazilian Amazon because of political reasons, basically. Unhappy people living in urban slums creates political instability. And Brazilian leaders have been recognizing that for a long time, has been sending people out into the Brazilian Amazon, where the first thing they do is they want to plant a farm, and they have to cut down the forest to do that. But it turns out that fertility in Brazil, like other parts of the world, is going down dramatically, and that the population of Brazil is almost certainly to decline within the century. So again, is population part of the story? It is for sure, but certainly not the biggest story right now. And also, a key question that you have to ask is where exactly in this example are the agricultural products that are being produced by those people moving out into the Brazilian Amazon being consumed? Remember, consumption is at least as important a part of the story here as population. And the answer to that is that the soybeans or the cows, etc., that are being produced in the Brazilian Amazon are largely, not exclusively, but largely being consumed outside of Brazil or by wealthy people within Brazilian society itself. So again, is population part of the story? Sure, absolutely. Is it the main story? That's debatable, for sure. Where I want to leave things is thinking again about this question of affluence, is that the inequality of wealth across the globe, and which we'll talk more and more about throughout this course, is creating a pattern. It's kind of inequality of wealth out the way A in the I equals Pat identity is distributed is very unequal. And what that's leading to in some parts of the world is very high ecological impact, but through a couple of different kinds of processes in different parts of the world. In the high consumption countries, in the rich countries, you see a different pattern than in the underdeveloped or the poorer countries, where in the in the less developed countries, what you see is high fertility that's driven by underdevelopment, lack of access to jobs, healthcare, education, um, uh, gender equality issues, and so on. And compare that to the high income countries where you're seeing large ecological impact predominantly through high rates of consumption. So the inequality of wealth globally is producing this sort of bifurcated pattern of high consumption in the rich countries that are growing the least in terms of population, and high fertility rates and underdevelopment in the poorer countries, which are at least in part, the high fertility rates are at least in part a result of the inequality of wealth distribution, the persistence of poverty in some parts of the world. So that inequality of wealth distribution across the globe is contributing to ecological impacts both directly through consumption in the wealthy countries and indirectly through continued high fertility in the poorer countries. So if you want to solve both of those problems, you can reduce inequality and simultaneously reduce population growth in the less developed countries and environmental impact in the wealthy industrialized countries. So let's go back to this question of is population an environmental problem? Well, if only 17% of the world's population is consuming the great majority of the world's resources, what does that say about the impact of population growth? I think what it says pretty clearly is that most of the world's population growth, again, is happening in the places in the world where there's relatively little environmental impact. So you can have a lot of population growth in sub-Saharan Africa with relatively little global scale ecological impact. And at the same time, in the wealthy countries, you're seeing most of the world's ecological impact is actually happening originating from those places where there's really very little population growth. So again, is population growth part of the story? Yeah, but it just doesn't seem like it's really the main story. So was Malthus right or wrong? The answer was he was wrong. And I think you can blame the conditions that we're facing now. Certainly, I showed you those graphs of accumulated greenhouse gas emissions. You can blame it a lot more on the wealthy countries, and including Russian billionaires and so on, than you can on people in India or sub-Saharan Africa and places like that. And so I think you can say the population is part of the story, but it's very heavily mediated by what's going on in society, including in particular, how wealth is distributed. So just to summarize, the world's biggest environmental problem, the world's biggest environmental problems are not driven mainly by population growth. They are, I think, demonstrably the world's biggest environmental problem is global climate change, obviously being the premier example. Consumption is a bigger part of the problem. I think that's very clear. And I think you have to say in terms of consumption, the inequality of consumption or the inequality of wealth or affluence drives both high levels of consumption in the rich countries and continued population growth in the poor countries. And to reduce environmental impacts if you remain concerned about population growth and you want to reduce population growth and its environmental impacts, then you should focus on things like providing healthcare and education to girls and young women in poor countries. But you should especially focus on reducing excessive consumption in the rich countries. I got those bullets a little bit backwards, but you get the point. So if you see population as an environmental problem, you can focus on questions like healthcare, education, gender equality, and so on. But you should really look at where most of the impact is actually happening, and it's not in poor countries where population is growing. It's largely us living in the wealthy countries where population is not growing at all, or in many cases, like Western Europe and Japan and so on, actually declining. So is population growth the number one environmental problem? I would challenge anyone to support that claim. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Yeah, that's my last slide. I'm going to leave it there. And next time we'll be talking about environmental economics, which to some extent sort of overlaps with our conversation last week about the so-called tragedy of the commons, more correctly described as the tragedy of open access, and in interesting ways actually overlaps with the population conversation we just had. So I look forward to seeing you all then.